Section 12 of Library Essays, Papers Related to the Work of Public Libraries. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Claire. Library Essays, Papers Related to the Work of Public Libraries by Arthur Elmore Bostwick. The Librarian as a Censor, Part 1. Footnote: Presidential Address before the American Library Association, Lake Minnetonka Conference, June 1908. End footnote. Some are born great, some achieve greatness, some have greatness thrust upon them. It is in this last way that the librarian has become a censor of literature. Originally the custodian of volumes placed in his care by others, he has ended by becoming in these latter days much else, including a selector and a distributor, his duties in the former capacity being greatly influenced and modified by the expansion of his field in the latter. As the library's audience becomes larger, as its educational functions spread and are brought to bear on more of the young and immature, the duty of sifting its material becomes more imperative. I am not referring now to the necessity of selection imposed upon us by lack of funds. A man with $5 to spend can buy only $5 worth from a stock worth $100, and it is unfair to say that he has rejected the unbought $95 worth. Such a selection scarcely involves censorship, and we may cheerfully agree with those who say that from this point of view the librarian is not called upon to be a censor at all. But there is another point of view. A man, we will say, is blackballed at a club because of some unsavory incident in his life. Is it fair to class him simply with the 50 million people who still remain outside of the club? He would, we will say, have been elected but for the incident that was the definite cause of his rejection. So there are books that would have been welcome on our library shelves but for some one objectionable feature whose appearance on examination ensures their exclusion, some glaring misstatement, some immoral tendency, some offensive matter or manner. These are distinctly rejected candidates. And when the library authority, whether librarian, book committee, or paid expert, points out the objectionable feature that bars out an otherwise acceptable book, the function exercised is surely censorship. May any general laws be laid down on the subject? Let us admit at the outset that there is absolutely no book that may not find its place on the shelves of some library and perform there its appointed function. From this point of view, every printed page is a document, a record of something material, as the French say, pour sévère, from a mass of such material, neither falsity, immorality, nor indecency can exclude it. I do not speak at this time, therefore, of the library as a storehouse of data for the scholar and the investigator, but rather of the collection for the free use of the general public, and especially of collections intended for circulation. It is to these that the censorship to which I have alluded may properly apply, and upon these it is generally exercised. I know of no more desirable classification of books for our present purpose than the old three categories, the good, the true, and the beautiful. Those books that we desire we want because they fall under one or more of these three heads. They must be morally beneficial, contain accurate information, or satisfy the aesthetic sense in its broadest meaning. Conversely, we may exclude a book because it lacks goodness, truth, or beauty. We may thus reject it on one or more of the three following grounds: badness, that is undesirable moral teaching or effect; falsity, that is mistakes, errors, or misstatements of fact; and ugliness, matter or manner offensive to our sense of beauty, fitness, or decency. The first and third qualities, badness and ugliness, are often wrongly confounded, and as I desire, therefore, to speak of them together, we will now take up the second, namely, falsity or lack of truth. Strangely enough, among all reasons for excluding books, this is perhaps least often heard. Possibly this is because it applies only to nonfiction, and apparently in the minds of many nonfiction is desirable simply because it is what it is. Again, the application of this test to any particular book can generally be made only by an expert. The librarian needs no advisor to tell him whether or not a book is immoral or indecent, but he cannot so easily ascertain whether the statements in a work on history, science, or travel are accurate. This lack of expert knowledge is bad enough when inaccuracy or falsity of statement is involuntary on the author's part. But of late we have in increasing numbers class of books whose authors desire to deceive the public, to make the reader take for authentic history, biography, or description what is at best historical fiction. Again, the increasing desire to provide information for children and to interest the large class of adults who are intellectually young but who still prefer truth to fictitious narrative has produced countless books in which the writer has attempted to state facts, historical, scientific, or otherwise, in as simple and at the same time as striking language as possible. Unfortunately, with some noteworthy exceptions, persons with comprehensive knowledge of a subject are generally not able to present it in the desired way. Cooperation is therefore necessary, and it is not always properly or thoroughly carried out, even where the necessity for it is realized. Proper cooperation between the expert and the popularizer involves 1. The selection and statement of the facts by the former, 2. Their restatement and arrangement of the latter, and 3. The revision of this arrangement by the former. It is this third process that is often omitted even in serious cyclopedic work, and the result is inaccuracy. Often, however, there is no cooperation at all. The writer picks up his facts from what he considers reliable sources, puts them into eminently readable shape, dwelling on what seem to him striking features, heightening contrast here and slurring over distinctions or transitions there. This process produces what scientific men call contemptuously newspaper science, and we have as well newspaper history, newspaper sociology, and so on. They fill the pages not only of our daily press, but of our monthly magazines and of too many of the books that stand on our library shelves. It is unfair to blame the newspapers alone for their existence. In fact, some of the best simple presentations of valuable information that we have appear in the daily press. Then there are the textbooks. Any librarian who has ever tried to select a few of the best of one kind, say elementary arithmetics, to place on his shelves, knows that their name is legion and that differences between them are largely confined to compilers' names and publishers' imprints. In part, they are subject to the same sources of error as the popularized works, and in addition to the temptation to hasty, scamped, or stolen work due to some publisher's or teacher's cupidity. This catalog might be extended indefinitely, but even now we begin to see the possibilities of rejection on the ground of falsity and inaccuracy. I believe that the chief menace to the usefulness of the public libraries lies, not as some believe in the reading of frankly fictitious narrative, but in the use of false or misleading history, biography, science, and art. Not the crude or inartistic printing of toy money, but the counterfeiting of real money is a menace to the circulating medium. Against such debasement of the sterling coin of literature, it is the duty of the librarian to fight, and he cannot do it single-handed. Some things he should and does know. He is able to tell whether the subject matter is presented in such a way as to be of value to his readers. He can tell whether the simple and better-known facts of history and science are correctly stated. He is often an authority in one or more subjects in which he is competent to advise as an expert, but only the ideal paragon, sometimes described but never yet incarnated, can qualify simultaneously as an expert in all branches of science, philosophy, art, and literature. The librarian must have expert advisors. Nor are these so difficult to obtain. The men who know are the very ones that are interested in the library's welfare and are likely to help it without compensation. And in the smaller places where the variety and extent of special knowledge is less comprehensive, the ground covered by the library's collection is also less, and the advice that it needs is simpler. The advice should, if possible, be personal and definite. No amount of lists, I care not who prepares or annotates them, can take the place of the friend at one's elbow who is able and willing to give aid just when and exactly where it is needed. As well might the world's rulers dismiss all their cabinet ministers and govern from textbooks on law and ethics, the formula, the treatise, the bibliography. We must still have all these, but they must be supplemented by personal advice. And competent advisors exist, as I have said, in almost every place. The local clergy on questions of religion, and often on others, too. The school principal on history and economics, the organist on music, the village doctor on science. Some such men will always be found able and glad to give advice on these subjects or some others. And the place is small indeed that does not include one or two enthusiasts, collectors of insects or minerals or antiquities, who have made themselves little authorities on their pet hobbies and may possibly be the greatest or the only living authorities on those local phases that particularly interest the local librarian. It will do the librarian no harm to hunt these men out and ask their aid. Possibly his own horizon will broaden a little with the task, and his respect for the community in which he works will grow as he performs it. But what if two of our doctors disagree? Then follow the advice of both. It might be disastrous for a patient to take two kinds of medicine, but it can never hurt a library to contain books on both sides of a question, whether it be one of historical fact, of religious dogma, or of scientific theory. This may not be pressed too far. The following of one side may be beneath our notice. It is not absolutely necessary, for instance, for a small popular circulating library to contain works in advocacy of the flatness of the earth or of the tenets of the angel dancers of Hackensack. But it is essential that such a library should make accessible to its readers the facts of the Reformation as stated by both Catholic and Protestant writers, histories of the American Civil War written from both the Southern and Northern standpoints, geological works both asserting and denying the existence of a molten core in the Earth's interior. An impartial book is hard to find. It is a thing of value, but I am not sure that two partisan books, one on each side, with the reader as judge, do not constitute a winning combination. Against violent and personal polemics, of course, the librarian must set his face. All such are candidates for rejection. It is fortunate for us, in this regard, that we are supplying the needs of all creeds, all classes, and all schools. Each must and should have its own literature, while each protests against violent attacks on its own tenets. Such protests, while often unjustified, are helping us to weed out our collections. So much for deficiency in truth as a cause for rejection. Now let us consider deficiency in goodness and deficiency in beauty, or stated positively, badness and ugliness. These two things are confounded by many of us. Is this because the great majority of librarians today are of the sex that judges largely by intuition and often by instinctive notions of beauty and fitness? To most women, I believe, all ugliness is sinful and all sin is ugly. Now, sin is morally ugly without doubt, but it may not be aesthetically so, and goodness may be aesthetically repulsive. Badness and ugliness in books are both adequate grounds for rejection, but they need not coexist. Some of the worst books are artistically praiseworthy and would be well worth a place of honor on our shelves if their beauty alone were to move us. On the other hand, some books that are full of impropriety or even of indecency are absolutely unimpeachable from a moral standpoint. Shakespeare and the Bible are often indecent without being in the least immoral. Raffles is in no wise indecent, but is dangerously immoral. Bernard Shaw is often both indecent and immoral, while at the same time so astoundingly clever that we stand gaping at him with our mouths wide open while he tosses down our throats the most unsavory things. What, then, is the distinction between badness and ugliness? For our present purpose, I believe it is to be this. Badness depends on immutable laws, while ugliness, at any rate that of the kind which concerns us here, is a matter of convention. Virtue, with all due apologies to Mr. Lecky and to many other eminent scholars, has certain standards that do not vary with place or time. Let us grant that a given act may be good today and bad tomorrow, good in Tasmania and bad in Pennsylvania. This is beside the question. We have here to do with a classification of this particular act in certain fixed categories that of themselves remain bad or good. The act of cutting off a man's head may be good if the cutter is the public executioner, and bad if he be a private citizen. One may shoot an attacking highwayman, but not an innocent friend. The reason for these differences, however, is that in one case the killing is murder, while in the other it is not. Murder itself always was and always will be bad. Impropriety or indecency, on the other hand, is purely arbitrary. Personally, I am inclined to think this true of all beauty, but it is unnecessary to obtrude this view here. Impropriety is a violation of certain social customs, and although I should be the last to question the observance of those customs, we must grant, I think, that they rest on foundations quite other than those of right and wrong. In fact, decency, instead of being on the same plane with morality, comes nearer to being properly ranked with those fixed categories mentioned above, which are themselves always good or bad, but which may or may not include a given act, according to circumstances. Murder is always bad, but whether the taking of life is or is not murder depends on the circumstances. It may depend entirely on motive. So indecency is always bad, but whether a given act or object is or is not indecent depends on circumstances. It may depend not only on motive, but on locality or environment. Objects and acts of the highest sanctity in one country may be regarded as low and vulgar in another. The standard varies from class to class, from one occupation to another, almost from family to family. One may mention in all innocence that which may bring a blush to the cheek of some listener simply because of this instability of standard in the matter of impropriety. To this class of things particularly refers the celebrated dictum, quote, "There is no thing in heaven or earth, Horatio, but thinking makes it so." End quote. This is unexceptionable Christian science, but it's not quite true. A higher authority than Shakespeare has asserted that by thinking one cannot make a single hair white or black, and this surely accords with the results of experience. Likewise, no one by thinking can make badness goodness or the reverse. But whether a thing be improper or not depends entirely on thinking. Thinking makes it so. It is improper for a Mohammedan woman to expose her face in public because she thinks it is, and because that thought is an ingrained part of her existence. But although the Persian sect of assassins thought with all their hearts that murder was good, it was still very evil. Are we getting too far away from the censorship of books? I think not. See the bearing of all this. If a book is really bad, if it teaches that evil is good or that it makes no difference, it ought to be rejected uncompromisingly, despite the fact that it is void of impropriety or even artistically admirable. But if it is morally unobjectionable and yet contains that which is improper or indecent, it is then proper to inquire whether the degree and kind of this indecency is such as to condemn it, particularly taking into account the condition, the intelligence, and the age of those who would be likely to read it, and also the time and the readers for whom, if it is an old book, its author originally wrote it. With increasing civilization, there are certain things that become more and more indecent, and others that become less and less so, owing to the shifting of points of view. End of section 12.